Hello, Aubrey. How are you? It's so good to see you as always. Are you having a good week?
I am having a good week. It's good to see you too, Doug. Yeah, um, just things keep rolling, and I appreciate our time together.
Yeah, I always look forward to our conversations about China and helping our listeners and our audience understand what our perspectives on China are. And this is as I often say to my classes and to anybody who will listen. In my opinion, this is one of the most critical times of U.S. China relations, and the last 45 years. And I always say 45 years because I like to sort of date things back to 1979 when Deng Xiaoping visited Jimmy Carter and sort of started China on this path of economic development and partnership. And then there was the partnership in the 1990s, which it brought forward the Clinton administration with Deng Xiaoping's administration, and then eventually China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And a much more laissez-faire period from 2001 to 2013 under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And then we saw Xi Jinping come to power in 2013. And that sort of really changed the dynamic, not just the dynamic of U.S.-China relations, really sort of China's standing up and, kind of really presenting itself to the world. It's the second largest economy in the world, and an economy that really needed to be taken seriously and reckoned with. And as you know, that was also the time that I entered China again in 2014 to go work for Apple. And so I was the lead person for Apple University in China, and then also just advised the company on how to deal with the politics of things. And I was there until 2019, and then things have just continued on in the 2020s. Again, things, as I often say to our listeners and to you, we're married to China. We are so deeply embedded in China with, Apple's deep embeddedness there, and Tesla's Gigafactory there, and Walmart's production there, and many other organizations and companies. And so it's a really critical time. But things have gotten tense in the Trump years. And so under the first Trump administration, from 2016 to 2020, there was, the first set of massive tariffs that really kind of shook things up. And then the Biden administration came in, and then Trump came back in 2024, or early 2025. And you and I have discussed this before, but we started to see just sort of, such a startling situation because of the trade war, tariff war, starting in January of 2025. And it looked like things were going to be really, really tense. And, I was again saying to people, we need to be very careful here because, if this gets really bad and China decides to kick Apple and Tesla and Walmart out of China, it's going to be bad for the U.S. economy. And then, as you and I've discussed before, we started to see things lighten up in September of 2025 because of the meeting between Chairman Xi and President Trump in South Korea. In which he called the meeting of the G2, and sort of really, kind of flattered Chairman Xi and flattered China, and a lot of people in China that I was talking to with my sources were very excited about this kind of reopening of the conversation, of this acknowledgement that we are the two largest economies in the world, and we are really going to be running things. And people have been very much looking forward to this 30th to April 4th. And then, of course, because of the war in Iran, things have been delayed. And so we're going to see President Trump go to China to meet with Chairman Xi in mid-May. And so everybody's tense and hoping that things are going to go. So what I wanted to do today, after that brief review, was to talk about a few things that have been in the news. And then I wanted to get back to the sort of larger substantive issues that you and I have been talking about over the course of the last several weeks. I want to talk a little bit about China and sustainability, and I want to talk about Chinese companies going global and China's leadership in the Global South. But then also talk about, we've been having this series on the 15th five-year plan, and we've been through several of the main issues of that in our conversations and in the writing that OGL has been doing. But there's other topics that we can explore there too. And so on to get a little bit into that. Does that sound like a plan?
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's get into it.
Okay. So a couple of things, if you just start looking at China in the news, I think there's a bunch of things that are sort of really will just jump out. The first, I think, that always deserves some discussion is the ways in which the U.S.-Iran war is affecting the Chinese economy, or, affecting all economies. But, like I'm such an extoller of the Chinese economy and talk about how strong the economy is and how it's moving into this not just position of the solid positioning as the second largest economy in the world, but the OGL team believes that China will be the largest economy in the world in 6 or 7 years. And it's really, really a powerful growth piece. And I'm getting into a little bit more of just reviewing why I would believe that's true and why that's so important in the more substantive part of the discussion. But just kind of thinking and talking about the specific moment in the war in Iran, China's being affected. I mean, there's no doubt about this. I mean, if you look at things like, a lot of economies, China included, but especially I think in China, we measure economies based on certain different products. And if you look at this year, April auto sales compared to a year ago, the same window of time for auto sales, automobile sales are down by about 26% in China. And so it's really, it's a startling moment to look at the April data, because what it says is that, things are serious. Now, it's not just auto sales that matter here. There's a lot of things that, have to do with the smaller light industry goods, and China's consumer markets are already, sort of a lot of economists, and I've talked about this before, a lot of economists talk about one of the main weaknesses in China's economy is the low consumer markets. And OGL's written about this. And yes, China has much lower consumer spending than, say, the United States. And, if you think about Adam Smith's virtuous cycle, where you have investment in a manufacturing economy and in the economy more generally, you have people making money, and then you have people spending money, and you get this virtuous cycle. And, it just happens to be the case that in China, it's not just a weakness of the economy. There's a cultural difference here. In that, in the U.S., the savings rate is about 3%. And if you think about that aggregate savings rate, that wealthy people with a lot of money are saving a lot of money, and working and middle-class people save a lot less in the United States. And China has a different cultural model than this, and that dates back, thousands of years to Taoism and Confucianism. And China's not the only one. I mean, Singapore's savings rate is very high as well. And, and there are a couple of, Northern European countries that have pretty high savings rates too. And so I don't think that this is as much of a problem in the economy in general as some economists who are critical of China's economy to think it is. But, and consumption and the savings rate issues are important parts of the economy. But the thing that we really are noticing now is a real decline in spending, especially within the last month. And this is tied to the war. I mean, this is, when you think about oil prices and how dependent China is on Strait of Hormuz trafficking of oil and how dependent it is on Iran, people are concerned. And so there is a really, there's been a sharp rise in oil and natural gas prices triggered by the conflict. And we're watching this. There's lots of things to talk about in terms of the current events of the war, but I just wanted to highlight for, our listeners that things are really, the war's having an impact. It's having an impact in many places around the world, but it's certainly having an impact on China. And
yeah, I can imagine, being a consumer in China, very much like being a consumer here, is that, when the gas prices go up, we see it all across, everything that we do, restaurant food, it costs more because the transportation costs to get the tomatoes from the farm to the distribution center to the restaurant, like that every step where there's transportation, those costs go up. And we see it, like I said, restaurant food. I'll see it, in the products I get at Target, perhaps, right? And I'll feel it in my own wallet as it's taking me, more and more dollars to fill up my tank to get to work. Yeah, if consumption was already a challenge for China, this is just going to make everything so much harder. Everything's going to cost more. People are going to spend less. They're going to save more. They're going to make choices like we do here. It feels like a very similar struggle as I'm seeing gas prices, some places over $4 here, which that hasn't happened in a long time in the United States. And, one thing I'm thinking about is, when we first started talking about the Iran conflict, I did some, just curious about, okay, well, how much, because I do remember, China saying, well, this is not a big deal. Like this war is not a big deal, won't impact us. The oil that China gets from Iran is like 10 to 12% from what I was seeing. But overall, when you look at where China gets its oil from, 50% comes from the Middle East. So of course it's going to have a huge impact. And of course that Strait, if Middle Eastern oil can't get through, it's not going to get to where it needs to go, and prices are going to go up. So yeah, this feels like I wonder about the conversation that's going to happen in May with President Trump and Xi. There's probably a lot to talk about, and maybe it's a good thing that it got delayed, because there's a little bit more leverage that can happen there between, China's just feeling a lot more pain than they were earlier.
That's an interesting observation, because yes, I mean, I know a lot of people in China have been really upset about the delay in the meeting, because they wanted to sort of see a continuation of this partnership of the G2 and, sort of treating each other with respect. And then the war happened, and this delay. And even before the war happened, I know that people in China were frustrated because President Trump's team wasn't usually the way China likes to prepare for meetings like this, is kind of really have, sort of deep thinking comparison for important meetings. And, an envoy will come over and kind of prepare for things with the team in Beijing. And then it gets ready for sort of the red carpet rollout when the president actually does show up. And that just wasn't happening, as I heard it from my sources in Beijing. And so it is an interesting thing about, then the war happens. And so I think people are very interested and concerned. That being said, to your point, there may be a sort of stronger negotiation leverage for the United States, because China's economy is feeling this. And so, so then sort of thinking, I'll have to think more about it, because I don't have any strong predictions, except to say it's clear that China's in a very powerful position in terms of the U.S. economy, because of how deeply embedded several companies are here. And, just because Apple, Foxconn has a final assembly plant in Chennai doesn't mean much, because, Apple works with about 1,600 Chinese suppliers to build the components, modules, and final assembly that send iPhones to the world. And I think we talked recently about, under Tim Cook, who's stepping aside in September, we've seen Apple become a $4 trillion company that was the second most valuable company in the world. And that's partly because Tim is a genius business operations entrepreneur and leader, but it's also because of the ways in which industrial clusters have been set up in China, and the ways in which Apple has been able to kind of work with the Chinese government and sort of counting its advisory work with Chinese companies and building efficient supply chains as fixed asset investment. And so anyway, I do think that China has leverage here. But to your point, difficulties and the issues in the market because of the war may give the Trump administration in the United States a little more leverage too. So that's an interesting analysis.
Yeah, I'm really, as you're talking, I'm thinking about just the differences again between, how China appears to operate and how the United States appears to operate, and the desire to have a well-prepared agenda and meeting and structure, where, we're over here just winging it. And I think, there's a lot of differences between how the United States appears to be led at the moment and how China has been led. It's a striking difference. Yeah, I'm very curious what's going to happen and how these conversations will go. I think the point of the United States having leverage over China, because we're making things difficult for them with this war. I wonder if there's more opportunity for partnership. I wonder if there's this will be a reason for China to get involved as an ally. I highly doubt it in Iran to help end the war. I doubt that, but it is very interesting that I think a lot of things have changed since the meeting got canceled, and I think the agenda probably continues to shift. I have no idea, but I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah, no, those are great observations, and we'll see. I mean, it's gonna. I'm on this just nervous about everything, just because I'm watching all of this and wanting things to kind of continue to evolve in partnership. And so we'll see. I'm hopeful that the Trump administration will show up in a way that that Chairman Xi's administration wants them to. And so both those things. Now, there are some things that are, in addition to the war in Iran, there's I don't know if you saw the news just a day or two ago, but Meta, and been working to have an acquisition of a Chinese founded AI startup called Mainland, and China just blocked it.
Tell me more. Like, yeah, I'm really curious about this and why that happened.
Well, so I want to be careful in linking it to exactly to what the tensions over the war in Iran were in terms of what we were just talking about. But the timing's interesting. But this is, sort of a separate type of issue because we're in competition with China and with the world over the development of AI and how AI is kind of, sort of transforming a lot of different sectors. I think you and I talked about a couple of weeks ago, but I was sort of making a comparison between the ways in which AI works in different places, right? And so in the United States, um, if you go online and listen to ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT what's the difference between China and the United States on AI, you generally get an answer that the United States is very good at building very personal approaches to, very, social and deep seeking. China's version is not that good at that kind of thing. But, as we've discussed before, and I've given talks on this, in China, they don't care about the personal aspect of these things. What they care about is building the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so the Chinese companies that I've worked with over the years are very, very intent on using AI to really kind of go deep with building manufacturing supply chains. So there's just differences here, and there are different emphases and focus and different kinds of competition. But, the idea that Meta was purchasing a Chinese AI company, I was surprised by that when I first read about it. And I was just sort of surprised. It seemed like, wow, okay, maybe it's a good thing because we need to just kind of continue being, growing in our partnerships. Like maybe I believe we should all be learning from each other. But the timing of this is a little startling to me because, it sort of seems to have to do with these issues of competition, the war, the situation of the economy. And so just very recently, China blocked the merger. And so I think there are interesting things to sort of extrapolate from that and to see, but this is not just because of sort of retaliating because of the economy's weakening because of the war. This really has to do with the competition between the two countries over AI. And so the idea that Meta would suddenly own the upstart Chinese AI company, I think the Chinese government just stepped in and said, nope, this is not happening.
Well, it's only fair, right? After, the United States has blocked so many, Chinese companies from working in the United States, as you know. And, so yeah, that makes sense. That was a big deal though. I mean, what is it? About $2 billion.
Yeah.
So if you're going to pay for it, I mean, that's pretty significant right there. Yeah. And curious how, Meta is competing now against, the other platforms. And they kind of saw this as, it's another tool in their arsenal to be more powerful. I mean, Meta is very powerful as it is. And if they were to have this AI, I mean, maybe we wouldn't have liked it either over here if they, if they added this, but it just seems like, it would make a really powerful company even more powerful. Wonder what the world would have looked like if this deal had gone through. I do love to see companies in different countries working together. But apparently, the governments don't like that to happen.
Right. Well, and in this particular case, again, the world is so focused on, AI and what it means for things. And, this wasn't just going to be good for collaboration, but it was going to be good for Meta because, not just having a Chinese startup, but a Chinese startup in AI, giving Meta access to the Chinese market, is again, that's what companies like Apple and Tesla have done already in the manufacturing space, but now Meta doing it in the AI space is, sort of a powerful circumstance, but it's not happening. And so it's an interesting time. We're living in interesting, they say.
And what is, that strikes me as like, well, what's the difference between partnering in manufacturing and partnering in software and this intellectual space? Because all day long, China is, welcoming, has welcomed companies like Apple and Walmart into their country. They're learning from them. They're, building their own, infrastructure around these, making the products that these companies want. And so what's the difference here is that there was less for China to learn from Meta with this partnership. I'm curious because there is, what is the difference between the digital world and the physical world and the supply chain? Like, I don't know. It seems like China's learned a lot from partnering with United States manufacturing companies. And perhaps they do, just want to keep things more separate. I get, cybersecurity, there's information flow, it's harder to track. Yeah, this is me just thinking out loud, but I would be curious if this also enters into the conversations to come in May between the two leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're asking great questions, and I don't have all the deepest answers to all of them. But again, I know the case with manufacturing very well, and sort of what the partnership has looked like and how much China has learned from companies like Apple and Tesla and a couple of others of really building these industrial clusters and manufacturing supply chain. In the AI space, it's interesting. I'm not really sure, but it suggests either A, there's just sort of a tit for tat thing going on here. Like if you're going to, hurt us to, by proxy, but through the war with Iran, maybe we're not going to go deeper with you and sort of sharing what we know about the AI market in China. And so, I just don't know. Like I'll have to look more into it, but it's an interesting case because, it is flexing muscles a little bit and saying like, we're not letting this happen. I'm sorry. And so it's a really interesting moment in time.
Yeah. And I guess, it's like with the digital space, it's treated much more like a defense system or, like the semiconductors, right? Like it's like, it's just, it's maybe too close to the security of, of both countries. And we can see that mistrust, happening between the countries, like we've talked about. So anyway, just think it's really interesting. What else has caught your eye in the news lately?
I mean, another thing that I was just, as you just peruse the news and kind of look at what's happening, it is a really interesting sort of reinvigoration of the of Chinese companies listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And so moving from Shanghai Stock Exchange, which is sort of the main mainland stock exchange, to moving tech companies over into the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has really seen an upsurge in the last year. And, it's an interesting phenomenon because of what it's, as somebody who watches China closely and, was in China when the sort of early, muscle flexing, I mean, if you remember the history here, in 1995, there was a deal that was signed, that sort of led to China's entry into the world, helped lead to China's entry into the World Trade Organization, that Hong Kong would still be separate but independent, but it would no longer be a British colony, but it would be sort of under the one country, two systems model that's sort of similar to Taiwan's relationship to Beijing. And that would exist until 2045. And so, there was just supposed to be no presence of sort of Beijing or China sort of military or control in Hong Kong for that time period. And then in 2017, that just ended. There were sort of protests going on about a couple of things, and, the Chinese military rolled in, and it was a tough moment for everyone to see because, what it meant was Beijing said we're not waiting until 2045. That's not happening. We're in control now. And so that was a very startling and difficult moment. Hong Kong's still sort of is this interstitial space between, mainland China that's deeply controlled by Beijing, and then you have Hong Kong sort of in the middle, and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange sort of feeling like a much freer place than other places that are on the mainland. But Beijing had sort of just been controlling that process. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is a number of mainland companies, are listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And we've really seen an upsurge in that area. And so it does, again, this are just interesting times to sort of think through like the dance that Beijing is doing in terms of really looking like an inviting place for Chinese companies to go global. Right. And there's an interesting moment here. That was the other piece that caught my eye in the news.
Yeah. And it looks like also that, that companies are listing in Hong Kong and not the US, which that I think, again, that's, from my perspective, is just another indication that the US is becoming less trustworthy for the world economy. And so if, that's been a kind of theme that we've seen, I believe, since, January, that they've been talking about. And, that'll be something to keep an eye on. And we're no longer the cool kid. And, people are feeling that we're risky. So yeah, companies are going to invest their future in stability. And I think that's what they're seeing in the, despite the economic challenges, they're seeing stability in China.
It's an amazing point, Aubrey. I love that framing of it. And you and I have talked about this in previous sessions about, like I have argued that China has become a very powerful market economic system. I'm not supposed to call them a capitalist system, but it's a very
Social market.
a great social market economy. But it's really, and there are lots of reasons that we've talked about in previous sessions about sort of local governments as industrial firms and the balance between central planning, sort of as, the markers of the 15th five-year plan, for example, and setting the agenda, but then really having entrepreneurial local governments that are, so anyway, it's a powerful market economic system. And, the U.S. has always been, for many, many decades and longer, it's been, a powerful capitalist economy, and we're very proud of that. But the time under President Trump has made things feel very uncertain. And so, we think trade wars are a brilliant thing because, they're raising prices at the border and therefore we're going to build manufacturing in America, which we know is not the case because, you don't just magically build manufacturing supply chains. It takes decades to build the kind of manufacturing supply chains that exist in China. And I think we discussed last week the senators who have basically been writing to the president, to President Trump, about not allowing BYD to come into the United States, which, as we discussed, I think is the dumbest idea out there because, yeah, of course, if you want to protect American automakers, BYD is a very, very powerful force in the global political economy. It's the most powerful EV company in the world right now. But learning from BYD on how to build the kind of manufacturing supply chain that is needed for electric vehicles is a good thing. It's going to create jobs. And so, again, to your point, it might just be the case that the U.S. is just looking like an uncertain partner here. And so, if we're seeing the push now for Chinese tech companies to list on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange instead of the New York Stock Exchange, that's significant, because those are resources that aren't going to come to the American markets. They're going to stay in China. So it's a really powerful time.
And it all just tells the story of all these little data points just tells the story of the shifting relationship. So you mentioned the 15th five-year plan just a minute ago. I know you wanted to talk about the 15th five-year plan, and I know that's been something that's on the minds of our team on Global Leadership. So maybe let's talk about that. And one of the focuses that I think that you've noted is aerospace. So I'm curious what catches your eye there.
Well, thank you for the question. And it's our team at OGL has been really kind of unpacking the 15th five-year plan. And so just to quickly review what we've talked about in terms of that, China has these 5-year plans, and these go back to the mid-1980s, and they became much more powerful systems when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978. And, again, these aren't like, central planning from, Moscow or Beijing, that we often think of as, the communist planning system. What they are is sort of high priority issues about what we're wanting all of our local economies to focus on in the next 5 years, right? And we've talked about, the issue of the joint venture education system, and we talked about, electric vehicles being a key area of focus. But most recently, my team has just written an article on another part of the 15th five-year plan, which is aerospace. And so the aerospace piece is really important, not just because, this is another part of economic development, but we're starting to really see very specific concerns that are listed in the 15th five-year plan that are about, sort of the crowded nature of low Earth orbits, the ways in which industrial application is influenced by the control of aerospace, the ways in which, going out into space is important for data and things like AI. You have players like Elon Musk and SpaceX, and so there's a lot of different things here that are not just about how are we going to build rockets and go to the moon? This is actually about sort of the control of space around the Earth. China emphasized a couple of key areas in the 15th five-year plan that are important, and I'll just call them out here. I mean, one was just basic commercial aerospace. So you have things like SpaceX and sort of, low-cost launch models that kind of relate to what enterprises are doing. And so, that's an important thing, like who is controlling the space around the planet. And that leads to a second point that's really important, which is who controls the satellite space, right? And so, like we think of space as being open and, you can always do whatever you need to do, except it's not, it's crowded just the way countries are crowded, right? Just the way oceans are crowded. And so like, it's very clear in the 15th five-year plan that the government's saying like, okay, yes, we are going to focus on things like electric vehicles and, continuing to build science and engineering joint venture universities, but we also have to focus on aerospace. And, so I think it's a really kind of important issue. Now, just to talk about satellite and internet aerospace is one thing, but they're also called out very specifically deep space exploration, right? And so they want to be thinking about, I mean, the United States just got a lot of press because we, had we didn't land on the moon, but we had the fly by the moon. And I think the furthest we've been out since the landing on the moon in 1969. And so, China wants to be one of the most powerful economies in the world as well. And so they're going to compete in this space. Here again, really just interesting and important times. And, our team has just been unpacking the 15th five-year plan that are, just sort of every layer. And the aerospace layer is one of those. And it's really important.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for whether it's, the math that takes, with the computing to get places, China's really good at, the technical aspects of AI. So I feel like they're going to be really powerful there. I think, they've got this manufacturing supply chain that, can manufacture all the components. I mean, I think that this is going to be an area where they're going to be very competitive very quickly because they have everything they need within their own borders to make this happen. So this feels like a very achievable goal, just knowing the little I do about China. But this feels like this is going to be something that we'll see a lot more leadership from China in the very near future, which I think these goals are, obviously the next 5 years. So we'll see what happens, by 2030. But I also wonder, is this when we finally get flying cars?
Yeah, it's a good, interesting question. And there has been sort of experimentation and discussion about this in the China market. And so I haven't seen it yet in our analysis of the 15th five-year plan exactly in terms of what they've been calling out, but you might be right. It could be. They will be competing in this space, I'm sure.
Right. I know. Yeah. I just think this is a really interesting time, and I'm glad to be, part of the team and, just watching things a little bit more closely than I would otherwise as just, average citizen Aubrey. So I think this is, I always learn a lot from our conversations, and, it gives me a much different perspective on what's happening in the world.
Well, I love our conversations, and I love, as I'm obsessed with talking about China and thinking about China, and it's been my obsession for my whole adult life. But I also, and I have lots of students that I teach to and talk to, and then some companies that I advise. But I love our conversations just because they're sort of, so dynamic and interactive. But we also end up, I kind of have to put my hat on as like the China scholar who's talking to, my brilliant American friend, Aubrey, and sort of talking to me about like, well, the tensions that you're seeing from the position of an American citizen on these issues. And so I think it's really fun.
Yeah.
The one final thing that I'll just mention before we let our audience go, is, it is interesting to see this dance between, on the one hand, some of the current event issues that we have where you got AI and meta issues and the tensions there. And then you have, also the war in Iran and the tensions there. And then you have, sort of the reinvigoration of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and what that might mean. And then you have the 15th five-year plan and aerospace. But the one other thing I do want to just remind our listeners about is there, as much as we talk about U.S. China relations, there is also a big push still in China and this isn't, as much listed in the 15 5-year plan, but I hear it all the time from the companies that I think about and advise. And I just want to raise two quick issues. One is that there is still a big push for Chinese companies going global. In Chinese, the term is chuhai, which means to go out into the ocean. And, it's a really important push because it's a part of China really reinvigorating or instating itself as the leader of the Global South, right? We've seen Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then the 6 other nations that have joined BRICS. But this is really about China going out and being the leader of that part of the world, right? And if you sort of put China and India together and we start to see companies like Foxconn building plants in Chennai, we're going to see more and more Chinese companies building their industrial clusters in India, and India learning a lot from China. And, that's 2.8 billion people, which is, about a third of the world's population. So it's a really powerful thing in thinking about this. Now, that being said, in the Belt and Road Initiative, China has, over the years, developed somewhat of a bad reputation, but I think it's a little bit overstated, or maybe a lot overstated, because the idea is China is just going into Africa and, building railways across countries, but they're only employing Chinese workers. And so it's not really creating jobs for the people in Zimbabwe. And which is partly true, but because China wants to sort of control the production processes of building this infrastructure. But it's not entirely true, because if you have a new railway, you're creating jobs for people in that country, right? And so you have to, and so, China is doing that, and they're kind of building this infrastructure, and it's really becoming a powerful thing in China's leadership in the Global South. And remember, that Global South isn't just the BRICS countries, but it goes all the way up through Africa, but also through the Middle East. And, it's interesting that countries in the Middle East have been talking about shifting their name from the Middle East to West Asia, because, it really kind of gives you a sense of where they are positioning themselves. But, and this is the final point that I'll raise for today is, I have one client right now that focuses a lot on sustainability. And it's a very powerful and interesting organization. And the development of the sustainability process in China, in China, it's a very upsetting thing to many officials, because, China is still, in people's minds, it's regarded as the place of cheap labor and polluting the world. China produces more and uses more solar panels than any country in the world, right? I mean, so if you want to talk about sustainability, it also has the #1 electric vehicle company in the world. And so, we want to talk about the use of fossil fuels versus electric vehicles. We want to talk about the use of solar panels versus, other forms of energy that are much more toxic. China's a leader in this space, but they haven't been good at marketing it. They haven't been good at, I've given talks to CFOs that are parts of companies, the leaders of companies that are going global. And, my message to them has always been, in China has always been, you guys have to get better at marketing yourselves. You got to get better at telling the story, and making that story public, because that's really going to sort of change the image of China. And so anyway, these issues we put together all of these issues of the 5-year plan, and then the mixture of what's happening with the oil pressures because of the Strait of Hormuz, and then, the issues of, Chinese companies, listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. You have a lot of complex things that are happening here. And so I think what we're seeing right now is not just the competition of U.S. China relations and China's economy becoming much more powerful, but what we're really seeing also is, the transformation of the image of China. And so I think it's a really interesting, dare I say, exciting time, Aubrey. I think it's a pressure on everybody, including the United States.
And just one final thought I had as you're talking, we see this, the energy, the oil dependence is causing, economic friction. And also China is really good at renewable energy, at sustainability. So I wonder if this current conflict is just going to accelerate the interest that's already obvious in renewable energy in China. So that'll be something I will maybe keep an eye on.
That's a really great and interesting observation. I mean, again, for some of these, what I always hope for, and I'll close with this, is I always hope that these things like our deep embeddedness of our two economies, and the fact that Guthrie always says we're married to China, but I hope that kind of deep embeddedness leads to more partnership. Partnership, and I say this to anybody in, U.S. politics that will listen to me. Partnership is better than competition because if we've talked about this with respect to the Huawei case, and yes, we pushed Huawei out and we made it illegal for any company to be selling any components for Huawei. So Huawei went and did their own technological development indigenously, but we don't have a sense of what they do anymore because we're not partners. We're not inside of what's happening. And so I just think, we're better off being partners. And I think that a lot of spaces like electric vehicles, but also in things like sustainability. So
Right.
it'll be really interesting to see how the current tension over the war and sort of the difficulties putting on China, but also, I'm hopeful for this meeting between President Trump and Chairman Xi because I just want to continue to see partnership.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. Well, thank you, Aubrey. It's so wonderful
Yeah.
talking to you, and I'll look forward to talking again next week.
Okay, that sounds good. See you next week, Doug.
See ya. Bye-bye. Okay.
That was fun.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Again, I feel I needed to start paying more attention to the world. But I think that was all right.
Just to push back a little bit on that, I thought you were great, and I thought we followed Tim's recommendation better. Instead of it, me every single, what do you think about that? But you just jumped in, and I thought it seemed much more natural, like we were just having a conversation instead of me interviewing you and you interviewing me. So
I appreciate your framing, and I kind of knew where you wanted to head. And so when I saw an opportunity to bring that up, so that felt, I think you I think you come across as the more powerful, confident version of Doug. And I also got to steer you a little bit. And I think that was helpful.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you. I'm just working on being a good personality and trying to balance not being overbearing, but being sort of a more confident version. The one thing I was worried about and conscious of is, we've talked about some of these issues before. And so I was worried that there were sort of duplicative issues. But I think I'm just going to propose this, and you can disagree if you did. First of all, the situation in China is complex enough that I often find when I'm giving talks or teaching students, like, repeating what you said before is okay because, people still need to know and understand. And, we may have hopefully new people in the audience that didn't hear the previous podcasts that talked about, some of the issues of sustainability of Global South. So hopefully it didn't sound too repetitive. I don't know. That was just observation, self-critical observation.
Yeah, I think you're right. There are things, I think you do have to give some of the context every time because we don't know if people have listened before, and then at the same time, I think that it doesn't have to be, I think it's enough that people have context, but not too much so that it feels like the same conversation. And I think that's just the balance we need to have is like, give them context, but don't make it feel like the same podcast that somebody else listened to last week. So I think you're doing a good job with that.
Thank you. And thank you for talking, and I hope everything's good and okay. One quick thing I'll remind Florian about this. It looks like our OGL call tomorrow is going to be hijacked by the AMP people.
Okay.
You can have tomorrow morning off.
Yeah, that's okay. That sounds good. I know you have some sticky things to talk through with based on what I understood from last week. So.
Yeah. And Chris is now invited to be on the call. So I think some things from last week have been forgiven. And so, but I'll just check back in with you and Florian, and we'll just make sure we keep pushing things along.
Okay.
And, so.
That sounds good.
All right. And I wish you a great week, and, we'll talk soon. I'm sure we'll talk before next week because, just to catch up on what we're going to do for the podcast for next week and just OGL business, and I'll get you and Florian your stipends, so we'll figure things out.
Okay, beautiful. All right, thank you, Doug.
Bye-bye. Can I tell you one thing? Sorry, maybe end the recording here. This is more private.